The revolving glass doors of St. Mary's Hospital spun with a soft whoosh as Ethan Cole stepped through, his presence commanding the kind of attention that followed him everywhere. His suit, pressed to perfection, reflected the meticulous control he demanded in every area of his life. For years, he had been a man known for impossible deals, boardroom victories, and an empire built brick by brick on relentless ambition. Yet tonight, beneath the sterile hospital lights, none of that mattered. The air was heavy with antiseptic, faintly mixed with the smell of coffee drifting from the lobby cafe. He glanced at his watch, his assistant close behind, reading out figures about a potential medical acquisition, numbers, strategies. Leverage. These were the languages Ethan had mastered. They were predictable, safe, unlike people. But people had a way of crashing into your life without permission. That had happened in an instant. From the far side of the lobby, a shape appeared. At first, it was only a silhouette framed by the dull glow of fluorescent lights. A woman, her posture tense, her hair tied back hastily as though exhaustion left her no choice. Beside her was a stroller, the faint squeak of its wheels cutting through the hush of late-night visitors. In her arms, she held something small, fragile. Ethan slowed, his chest tightening in a way he couldn't name. His assistant's words faded into background static. The world suddenly narrowed to that single figure, the one person he had trained himself never to think about again. Lena. Her name slammed into his mind like a wave against stone. He had spent years burying it beneath accomplishments and accolades, convincing himself that success could erase what he walked away from. Yet here, she was alive, real, holding something that made his heart stutter. He had never expected to see her again, much less like this, cradling a child close to her chest while two others shifted beneath blankets in the stroller. The noise of the hospital fell away. No ringing phones, no chatter of nurses, just the pounding of his own pulse, loud and unforgiving. He froze mid-step. Lena looked thinner than he remembered, though not in a way that dimmed her strength. Her shoulders were squared, her jaw tight. She wasn't fragile, she never had been. But there was a weariness in her eyes that hadn't been there years ago, a weight carved from nights of worry and days spent fighting battles alone. And then there were the children. Ethan's gaze caught on them with a painful sharpness. 3 small faces, 3 sets of eyes that mirrored something disturbingly familiar. Blue. His legs felt rooted to the marble floor. No deal, no empire, no amount of discipline had prepared him for this. The woman he abandoned was standing before him, surrounded by life he might have had a hand in creating. He wanted to believe it wasn't possible, that this was a trick of exhaustion, or worse, a cruel punishment from the universe. But the resemblance was undeniable. The child in her arms shifted, revealing a tuft of dark hair that gleamed under the fluorescent lights. One of the babies in the stroller blinked up, wide-eyed and curious, their tiny fingers curling as though reaching for the world. Ethan's throat tightened. He had seen boardrooms collapse, economies shake, rivals fall, but nothing ever made him feel this powerless. Lena hadn't noticed him yet. She was too focused on adjusting the blanket draped over the infant in her arms, her lips moving in a soft lullaby. Ethan remembered that voice, though it belonged to a different lifetime. A voice that once steadied him when success seemed hollow. A voice that once made him believe in more than ambition. When she finally lifted her head and their eyes met, time fractured. Her reaction was not joy, not relief, not the wistful reunion he'd played out in half-forgotten daydreams. Instead, her entire body went rigid, her grip tightening protectively on the baby as if to build a barrier between them. Her lips parted slightly, but no words came. Her gaze was sharp, cold, and filled with something Ethan couldn't bear to name: betrayal, anger, hurt. For a moment, neither of them moved. Ethan took a step forward, every part of him trembling, with words he didn't know how to say. "Lena," his voice cracked, sounding far and even to himself. Her knuckles whitened against the stroller handle. She pulled the children closer, as if shielding them from a threat. Her silence was louder than any accusation. He wanted to ask, needed to ask, were they his? Could it be possible that the life he had run from had followed him, taken shape in these 3 small souls? But his mouth was dry, his courage faltering. She saw the question in his eyes before he dared to speak it. Her lips curved not into a smile, but into something tighter, bitter. "Don't." Her voice was low, controlled, yet trembling at its edges. "Don't say my name. You don't get to anymore." Her words hit harder than any market loss or failed deal ever could. Ethan's assistant shifted awkwardly behind him, clearly aware this was no business negotiation. The bustling lobby seemed to swirl with people passing by, but all Ethan saw was her Lena, standing as a fortress, and the children she shielded like precious treasures he no longer had a right to. "I didn't know," Ethan whispered finally, as if the admission could soften the blow, as if ignorance could ever excuse absence. "Of course you didn't," Lena replied, her jaw tightening. "You didn't stay long enough to find out." Her words cut straight through him, stripping away every defense he had built. He remembered the night he left convincing himself it was necessary. That ambition required sacrifice, that love was chaos he couldn't afford. He had told himself he was protecting her from the storm of his life. In truth, he had been protecting himself from vulnerability, from responsibility, from a future that terrified him. Now that future stood before him, staring at him with blue eyes that didn't yet understand who he was. He tried to step closer, desperate to bridge the chasm between them. "Lena, please, we need to talk." Her expression hardened, though her eyes shimmered with unshed tears. "No, Ethan, you need to leave. These children have no idea who you are, and I intend to keep it that way." The babies stirred, one of them letting out a soft cry that broke the tension for only a moment. Lena rocked gently, whispering soothing words. Ethan's chest ached with a longing so fierce it nearly buckled him. He had spent years chasing numbers, and yet in one unplanned encounter, he realized the most important equations of his life had been left unsolved. And for the first time in years, Ethan Cole, the man who built an empire, the man who never faltered, felt utterly powerless. But as he stood in that sterile lobby, staring at Lena and the children who might be his, one thought rooted itself deeply in his mind. He couldn't walk away again, that not this time. The echo of her words stayed with him long after she pushed past, maneuvering the stroller with the careful precision of someone who had lived this routine 1,000 times. Ethan remained frozen in the lobby, his assistant whispering his name, but it barely reached his ears. His empire, his calendar, the endless meetings waiting for him, none of it mattered in that moment. His eyes lingered on the hospital corridor where Lena had vanished, the soft cries of one of the babies trailing faintly behind her like a ghost. He felt hollow. For years, Ethan had believed walking away was his choice, his power. He had justified it with ambition, with the idea that love only complicated a life designed for control. He had convinced himself Lena would move on, that she deserved better than the fractured pieces of him. But he never imagined she would carry pieces of him anyway, pieces that blinked with his eyes, breathed with his blood, lived without his name. The lobby felt suffocating, without a word. Ethan turned on his heel, ignoring the confusion on his assistant's face. He didn't care what meeting he was late for. He needed answers. He needed her to tell him what those children meant, even though he already knew the truth gnawed inside his chest. By the time he found himself outside the pediatric wing, he stopped, his hand pressed against the cool glass of the observation window. Nurses moved briskly down the hall. Parents hovered anxiously over little ones in beds, and somewhere among them was Lena. He caught sight of her near a consultation room, gently settling the babies. She bent over one of them, her hand brushing over their forehead with such tenderness that Ethan's chest ached. She didn't need him. That was obvious. She had built a world without him, and though it looked fragile from the outside, it was whole because she had given everything of herself to make it so. 1,000 rehearsed words tangled in his throat. He had negotiated mergers worth billions, with less fear than the thought of approaching her again. But this wasn't a boardroom. This was life is life. And he had already lost years he couldn't get back. Ethan took a step forward, and this time Lena saw him first. Her gaze hardened, her body stiff as though bracing for a storm. "I told you to leave," she said, her voice sharp enough to cut through the air. "I can't," he admitted, surprising even himself. "Not now, not after this." Her arms tightened around the child in her arms, her expression unreadable. You don't get to decide when you're ready to show up, Ethan. That privilege left the night you walked out." Her words were a blade twisted in old wounds. He wanted to defend himself, to explain the chaos that had consumed him back then. But excuses sounded pathetic even in his mind. He had abandoned her, plain and simple. Nothing could erase that. "Are they mine?" The question tumbled out before he could stop it. His voice cracked, vulnerable in a way it hadn't been in years. The silence that followed was crushing. Lena looked at him for a long time, her jaw working as though the weight of truth pressed heavily against her chest. Then she whispered, "What difference would it make? You weren't here." It was the answer he both dreaded and deserved, yet it pierced deeper than anything else. He saw it then how much she had carried alone, the sleepless nights, the sacrifices, the impossible choices. She had borne it all, and in her eyes was both the exhaustion of that fight and the fierce pride of survival. "Let me make it right," Ethan pleaded, his voice unsteady. "Please, Lena. I can't undo the past, but I can be here now. I can." Her laugh cut him off, low and humorless. "Be here now. Do you have any idea what being here means? It means midnight fevers. It means bills stacking up when medicine costs more than rent. It means holding 3 crying infants and realizing you haven't eaten in 2 days because they needed everything before you did. Where were you for that, Ethan? Where were you when it mattered?" Each word struck like a hammer. But he didn't look away. He let her rage hit him, because she deserved it, because it was truth, raw and unfiltered. "I was a coward," he admitted, his shoulders sagging. "I thought I couldn't be what you needed. I thought leaving was protecting you from me. But I see now I wasn't protecting anyone. I was running, and I will regret it for the rest of my life." Her eyes flickered, the anger faltering for just a heartbeat before she steeled herself again. "Regret doesn't change diapers. Regret doesn't rock a baby to sleep." "I know," Ethan whispered. "But maybe it can teach me not to waste what little time I have left with them, with you." Lena's lips parted, as if to respond, but then a nurse approached, reminding her about a scheduled checkup. She adjusted the carriers, avoiding Ethan's gaze, and moved toward the room without another word. The door closed behind her with a soft click that felt louder than a slammed door. Ethan stood in the corridor, feeling the weight of 1,000 eyes that weren't actually there. For the first time in years, he had no control, no strategy, just raw desperation. He could have walked away then. It would have been easier, the familiar escape he had always chosen. But something inside him refused. The sight of those children, tiny, innocent, unknowing, had ignited a part of him he didn't recognize. A father's instinct, a man's redemption. He spent the next hour waiting, pacing the corridor. He thought about Lena's words, about every lonely night she must have endured without him. He thought about the life he had chosen instead, luxury, deals, power, all of it hollow compared to the fragile beauty he had glimpsed in her arms. When Lena finally emerged, her face was tired but calmer. She stopped when she saw him still there. "You're stubborn," she muttered, almost to herself. "For once, I'm stubborn about the right thing," he replied. She studied him, as though searching for cracks in his resolve. For years, she had only known the man who left, the man who chose ambition over love. Now she saw someone else, still flawed, still guilty, but standing, refusing to leave again, go home. "Ethan," she said softly, though her voice lacked the sharpness it once had. "This isn't your world anymore." He shook his head. Then, "Let me earn a place in it, whatever it takes. I'll prove it to you, Lena, to them. I won't run this time." She didn't answer. Instead, she adjusted the blankets, kissed each child softly, and walked past him. But just before she reached the exit, she glanced back for the briefest second. Her eyes softened like a door opening, just a cracked dot. It was enough to give Ethan hope, enough to fuel the fire that he would not let die. As the hospital doors slid closed behind her, Ethan Cole knew one thing with certainty. His empire might have been built on steel and glass, but his true battle had just begun, and this time, losing was not an option. The night after seeing Lena again, Ethan sat in his penthouse staring at the glittering skyline that once filled him with pride. The city pulsed with the energy of his empire, towers he had built, contracts he had signed, victories that carried his name. Yet for the first time, none of it mattered. Every success he had ever chased seemed hollow compared to the image burned into his mind. Lena's exhausted face, the 3 children clinging to her, and the cold dismissal in her voice when she told him to leave. Sleep evaded him. Each time he closed his eyes, he saw the curve of those tiny blue eyes, his eyes staring back at him from fragile faces. The weight of their existence pressed heavily on his chest. He had spent years believing that control was his greatest strength, but what good was control when it had cost him everything that truly mattered? The next morning, Ethan did something he hadn't done in years. He canceled his meetings. His assistant nearly fainted when he announced he wouldn't be in the office. Family emergency. He muttered, though the word family felt foreign on his tongue. Still, it was the truth. Even if Lena would never admit it. He found himself back at St. Mary's Hospital, this time without his polished entourage, without a plan. He didn't know what he was going to say or do, only that he couldn't let Lena vanish again. When he reached the pediatric wing, he caught sight of her through a glass panel. She was holding one baby while balancing a bottle for another in the stroller, her movements tired but practiced. The third cried softly, tugging at her shirt. Ethan's chest tightened. She looked like she was drowning and yet refusing to let herself sink. Before he could knock, a nurse approached Lena with a chart. The way Lena's shoulders slumped told Ethan the news wasn't good. She bit her lip, nodding as the nurse explained something he couldn't hear. Then she glanced at the children with a look that broke him completely. Worry, fear, and fierce determination all tangled together. He couldn't stand outside any longer. He pushed open the door. Lena's head snapped up, her expression instantly hardening. "I told you to leave me alone." Ethan raised his hands, his voice quiet. "I know, but I couldn't. Please, just let me help." Her laugh was bitter. "Help with what? You think you can throw money at this and fix years of absence? These are children, Ethan, not another one of your acquisitions." He flinched at her words, but didn't back down. "Then teach me. Tell me what to do. Because standing by while you carry this alone, it's not an option anymore." The baby in her arms whimpered, and instinctively Ethan stepped closer. "Can I?" He reached out, his hands trembling. For the first time in years, vulnerability stripped him bare. Lena hesitated, her eyes searching his face for sincerity. Finally, with a reluctant sigh, she shifted the child into his arms. The weight of the tiny body against his chest nearly undid him. The baby blinked up at him, innocent and unknowing, and in that moment, Ethan felt something he had never felt before, an overwhelming surge of responsibility, of love, of belonging. He rocked gently, remembering how his mother once held him when nightmares came. The baby quieted, a small fist curling against his thigh. Ethan swallowed hard, fighting the lump rising in his throat. Lena watched him, her expression unreadable. "Don't think one moment erases everything," she said finally. "You can't just walk back in and expect me to believe you've changed." "I don't expect you to," he whispered. "But let me prove it, not with words, with actions." Her eyes softened for just a moment, then hardened again. "Actions take more than a few days. Ethan, they take years. Years you weren't here." "I know," he admitted. "But if it takes the rest of my life, I'll spend every day making up for what I missed." For a long moment, silence hung heavy between them. Then the nurse returned, interrupting with the chart. Lena listened intently, her brow furrowing. Ethan leaned closer, catching fragments of the conversation. "Special medication, expenses, follow-up care." When the nurse left, Lena sighed and pressed her fingers to her temple. Ethan spoke gently. "Is everything okay?" She looked at him, exhaustion etched in every line of her face. "One of them has a respiratory issue. It's manageable, but the medicine is expensive. Insurance barely covers it." She shook her head. "I'll figure it out. I always do." Ethan's heart twisted. "Let me take care of it." Her eyes flashed. "There it is, your solution. Money, always money, because it's the only thing I know how to use," he admitted. "But I want to learn what else it takes. I want to be there for the long nights, the hard days. I don't want you to carry this alone anymore." Lena looked at him for a long moment, as if weighing his soul. Then she turned back to the babies, her voice quiet. "You say that now, but when it gets hard, when they're crying for hours, When everything feels impossible, will you still be here, or will you leave again? Her question sliced through him. He thought of the man he used to be, the one who ran from love, from responsibility, from anything that threatened his control. But looking down at the child in his arms, he knew that man no longer existed. "I won't run," he said firmly. "Not this time, not ever again." The words weren't rehearsed. They weren't part of some strategy. They were raw, born from the undeniable truth inside him. Lena didn't respond. But for the first time since their encounter in the lobby, she didn't push him away. She let him hold the baby a little longer, let him stand beside her while she fed the others, and though the distance between them was still vast, Ethan felt something fragile beginning to shift. Later, as he left the hospital, he glanced back through the glass doors. Lena sat in the waiting area, surrounded by their children. Her head bowed as she whispered to them. Ethan knew the road ahead would not be easy. It would take patience, persistence, humility, qualities he had long buried beneath ambition. But he also knew this. He had been given a second chance, a chance he didn't deserve but refused to waste. As the city lights blurred around him, Ethan Cole made a silent vow he would fight for them, for Lena, for the children, for the life he once feared, but now realized was the only one worth having. And deep down, he understood this was only the beginning. Ethan had always thought redemption came in sweeping gestures, grand announcements, large checks, skyscrapers built with his name etched in steel. But in the days that followed, he began to realize that redemption wasn't about noise. It was about silence, consistency, and showing up when no one expected him to. The challenge was, Lena expected him to disappear. She was certain he would. And if he was honest with himself, so was he. Because that was the kind of man he had been before. A man who fled when love demanded more than he was willing to give. But now, with the image of those children engraved into his mind, leaving wasn't an option. On the third morning after their encounter, he found himself back at St. Mary's before sunrise. The hallways were quiet, the hum of machines and distant, footsteps filling the stillness. Lena was already there, cradling one baby while balancing paperwork in her lap. Dark circles clung under her eyes, evidence of nights without rest. She didn't see him at first. She was lost in thought, her lips pressed together as though she was carrying an entire world on her shoulders. Ethan approached slowly, unsure if she would throw him out again. When she finally looked up, her eyes flickered in surprise, then quickly narrowed. "You're still here," she whispered, as though his presence was both confusing and irritating. "I said I wouldn't leave," he replied softly. "I meant it." Her gaze lingered on him, doubtful, before she turned her attention back to the baby in her arms. "Consistency isn't your strong suit, Ethan. You show up when it's convenient, then you vanish." He winced because it was true, but instead of defending himself, he sat down across from her, his hands clasped in front of him. "Then let me prove you wrong." The next hours were not what he was used to. There were no contracts, no polished tables, no sharp suits. Instead, he held bottles, burped babies, fetched water, and signed his name to insurance forms that Lena had been juggling alone. The smallest tasks felt monumental. When one of the children clutched his finger, refusing to let go, Ethan felt a shift in his chest that shook him more than any victory. In his career, Lena didn't thank him. She barely acknowledged him, but she also didn't ask him to leave. That was enough for him to keep coming back. Over the next week, he carved out time he didn't have. Meetings were rescheduled, calls ignored, executives left wondering why. Their CEO had suddenly vanished from boardrooms. Ethan didn't care. He was busy learning how to fold blankets the way Lena did, busy rocking restless infants to sleep, busy trying to stitch together a presence he had once torn apart. Still, the wall around Lena never lowered. Her eyes remained guarded, her voice clipped, her body language cold. She didn't trust him, and she had no reason to. Every time he reached out, she stepped back. Every time he tried to help, she reminded him he wasn't entitled to this family. And yet there were moments, fleeting, fragile moments, like when one of the babies laughed for the first time in his arms and Lena's lips twitched, as if she wanted to smile but forced it back. Or when exhaustion overtook her one afternoon, and she fell asleep in the hospital chair while he stayed awake, watching over the children. She didn't stir, didn't push him away, and for that hour he let himself believe she trusted him enough to rest. But the greatest test came late one evening when Lena stepped out to speak with a doctor, leaving Ethan alone with all three. Within minutes, chaos erupted. One baby cried, then another, then all three. He froze at first, panic rising in his chest. His empire had trained him to manage crises of millions. Yet here he was unraveling at the sound of his children's cries. Then, something inside him shifted. He whispered softly, rocking one in his arms while reaching for another. He sang an old tune his mother used to hum when he was a boy. His voice was shaky, uncertain. But the crying slowly quieted. When Lena returned, she found him sitting there with all three babies bundled against him. His voice low and tender. For the first time, her eyes softened fully, without anger or bitterness. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. The silence said enough. Still, Ethan knew one small victory didn't erase years of absence. He wanted more than to be tolerated. He wanted to be trusted. And trust had to be earned. One night, as he drove home, the weight of everything pressed down on him. His phone lit up with dozens of missed calls from his board. A critical deal was hanging in the balance, and for the first time in his career, he didn't care. His empire could wait. What mattered now were the children asleep in the hospital, and the woman who had carried them through storms he never witnessed. But then the thought struck him, what if she never let him in? What if no matter how hard he tried, Lena refused to forgive? Could he live with being close yet never truly part of their lives? He gripped the steering wheel, his jaw tight. For the first time, he wasn't afraid of losing money, or power, or his reputation. He was afraid of losing them. The following morning, when he arrived at the hospital again, Lena looked at him differently. Her exhaustion was heavier. Her shoulders slumped. "One of them needs surgery," she said quietly, her voice breaking. For the first time, the words struck Ethan like a blow. He moved closer, searching her face. "What do you need?" Her eyes filled with tears. She tried to blink away. "I need them to be okay. I don't care how. I don't care what it takes." In that instant, Ethan realized this wasn't about proving himself to her anymore. This was about fighting for those children's lives. His money, his empire, everything he had meant nothing compared to their chance at survival. He took her trembling hand gently in his. "Then we'll do this together. Whatever it costs. Whatever it takes." For the first time, Lena didn't pull away. She let his hand linger, and though her eyes still carried doubt, there was something else there too, something fragile but alive. It was hope. The news of the surgery hung in the air like a storm cloud. For a long moment, Ethan couldn't breathe. He had faced hostile takeovers, billion-dollar gambles, and the crushing weight of boardroom battles, but nothing had ever left him this powerless. Lena's voice trembled as she explained the doctor's plan, her hands gripping the chair so tightly her knuckles turned white. Ethan sat silently beside her, absorbing every word. But inside his chest, it felt like glass was shattering. The baby who needed surgery was so small, so fragile, wrapped in a blanket that seemed too big for a body that delicate. Ethan leaned over the crib, watching the rise and fall of a chest that seemed to fight for every breath. His throat tightened. How had he been so blind, so absent, when moments like these were unfolding without him? Lena stood at the foot of the crib, her eyes fixed on the child. She didn't look at Ethan, didn't ask for his comfort. She had carried the burden of parenthood alone for too long to suddenly let him in. And yet, in the stiffness of her shoulders, in the way her lips pressed together as though holding back a scream, Ethan saw her unraveling. "Tell me what they said," he asked finally, his voice low, careful not to disturb the quiet around them. "They said, the surgery is risky." Her voice broke. She blinked rapidly, forcing the tears back. "They can't guarantee anything. They just said it has to be done. Otherwise," her words faltered. But she didn't need to finish. Ethan felt his chest tighten with a kind of fear he had never known. He wanted to promise her everything would be fine. But for the first time in his life, he realized money couldn't write a guarantee. What he could do, however, was fight. "We'll get the best," he said firmly. "If this hospital doesn't have what's needed, I'll bring in someone who does." I don't care where they're from, what it costs, or what strings I have to pull. No door will stay closed, not for them. Lena finally looked at him, her eyes sharp with the memory of broken promises. And when it's over, when the danger passes, if it passes, are you going to vanish again? Her words cut deeper than she knew. Ethan leaned back, his gaze steady. Not this time. You don't have to believe me, just watch me. It was the first time he didn't try to convince her with apologies or excuses. He only gave her resolve. That night, Ethan didn't go home. He stayed at the hospital, calling in favors from contacts across the world. Surgeons in Europe, specialists in the US, pediatric experts who were booked years in advance. He reached them all. His reputation opened doors, his money kept them open. But it was desperation in his voice that made them listen. By dawn, he had assembled a team of doctors who would fly in within hours. When Lena saw the list of names, her lips parted slightly in disbelief. You really did all this overnight? Every second counts. He answered simply, for the first time. Since their reunion, Lena had no words to throw at him. She just stood there, caught between doubt and reluctant admiration. The day of the surgery came faster than either of them were ready for. Ethan sat in the waiting room, his hands clasped so tightly his knuckles hurt. Lena paced the floor, her nerves unraveling with each tick of the clock. She hadn't wanted him there at first, but when the nurse asked who would sign the final consent form, she didn't stop Ethan from stepping forward with her. He didn't hesitate. He signed his name as though his life depended on it. The hours crawled by. Every sound from the corridor made them both jump. Lena eventually sat down beside him, her face buried in her hands. Without thinking, Ethan reached out. To his surprise, she didn't pull away when his hand brushed hers. She let it stay, trembling but connected, as though some part of her was too tired to keep fighting the barrier she had built. When the surgeon finally emerged, time seemed to freeze. Ethan rose to his feet, bracing himself for the worst. The doctor's tired smile felt like sunlight breaking through clouds. It went as well as we could have hoped. Your baby is strong. They'll need careful monitoring, but they made it through. Lena collapsed into her chair, tears spilling freely for the first time. She pressed her hands against her mouth, shoulders shaking with relief. Ethan stood there, his eyes burning, his body trembling with emotions he had spent a lifetime locking away. He crouched down in front of her, his hands steadying her trembling one. For the first time, she didn't resist. She let him hold it. Her tears fell onto his knuckles. And he didn't move, didn't speak. He simply stayed. Because presence was the one thing she needed most. When they were finally allowed back into the room, Ethan approached the crib slowly. The baby looked even smaller than before, wrapped in wires and monitors, but alive. The sound of steady beeping filled the air like a fragile heartbeat of hope. Ethan placed his hand gently on the blanket, his vision blurring. Thank you, he whispered, not to the doctors, not to fate, but to the tiny fighter who had refused to give up. Lena stood beside him, her expression soft but unreadable. She didn't thank him, she didn't forgive him, but she didn't push him away either. For Ethan, that was enough. Later that night, when Lena finally allowed herself to rest in the chair beside the crib, Ethan stayed awake. He watched over the baby, his thoughts spinning. For the first time in years, his empire didn't cross his mind. His board could wait, his investors could wait, the entire world could wait. Here, in this sterile hospital room, was everything he had ever been too blind to see. And yet, even in the peace of that moment, a storm brewed in his chest. He had proven he could fight for their children, but the question remained, would Lena ever allow him to fight for her heart again? The battle wasn't over. It had only just begun. The hospital room felt quieter in the days that followed, though the beeping of monitors still filled the air like an unending reminder of fragility. Ethan had barely left his child's side. Every morning, nurses came in and out, whispering updates, adjusting medications, while Lena tried to balance exhaustion with a determination that only a mother could carry. But now, for the first time, there was no immediate crisis. The baby was stable, and that small word stable brought more relief than all the promises in the world. Yet stability didn't mean peace. Ethan could feel it every time he glanced at Lena. She was guarded, cautious, keeping her distance even when their chairs sat inches apart. She had allowed him into this battle for their children, but she hadn't allowed him back into her heart, and Ethan knew that if he didn't bridge that gap, all the promises he made, all the efforts he gave, would vanish the moment they left. This hospital. One evening, as the rain tapped against the window, Lena stood by the crib, humming softly to the child. Her voice was tender, carrying a song she had likely sung countless nights alone. Ethan watched her in silence, realizing this was the version of Lena he had missed, the version he had abandoned when he walked away years ago. And suddenly, guilt cut sharper than ever. "Lena," he said finally, his voice low, almost uncertain. "Can we talk, really talk?" She turned, her expression unreadable, her eyes rimmed with the weariness of too many sleepless nights. "What is there to say that hasn't already been said?" "Everything," Ethan admitted. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, hands clasped tightly as though holding himself together. "I thought leaving would protect you from the chaos of my world. I told myself I was giving you freedom, but the truth is, I was protecting myself from the responsibility of being a man you and our children could count on. I was a coward, Lena, and I hate myself for it every day." Her lips pressed into a thin line, and for a moment she looked away, as if the weight of his words pressed too heavily against the walls she had built. "Do you know how many nights I prayed you'd come back?" she whispered. "How many times I told myself you'd walk through the door, even when I knew better." Her shoulders shook slightly, but her voice grew harder. "And when I finally accepted you weren't coming, I had to bury that part of me. I couldn't live in hope anymore. Hope was killing me." Ethan's chest ached with her every word. He wanted to reach out, to wipe away the tears threatening to fall, but he didn't move. He couldn't rush this moment. It wasn't about fixing everything with one touch or one apology. It was about showing her he was finally willing to sit in the pain he had caused instead of running from it. "I can't undo what I did," Ethan said quietly, his eyes never leaving hers. "But I can change what I do now. I don't want to be the man who ran. I want to be the man who stays. If you never forgive me, I'll understand. But please, Lena, let me prove it to our children. Let me prove it to you, even if it takes the rest of my life." The silence that followed stretched painfully. Lena's jaw trembled. Her arms folded across her chest as though bracing herself against him. But her eyes lingered on him longer than before, and in that lingering, Ethan saw the faintest crack in her armor. That night, after she finally drifted into sleep in the chair beside the crib, Ethan stayed awake. He pulled out his phone, not to check his company's updates, but to write an email to his board. For the first time, he handed over responsibilities he had never let go of. He told them he would step back, not permanently, but indefinitely, because his life wasn't just about empire anymore. It was about two small children who needed a father, and a woman who needed to see that he wasn't going to vanish again. Days turned into weeks, and the baby grew stronger. The wires slowly came off, the monitors were removed, and the doctor finally said the words they had been waiting for: "You can take them home soon." Relief swept over Lena, but with it came a new storm, because leaving the hospital meant facing a new reality, one where Ethan wasn't just a visitor in a sterile room, but a presence in their daily lives. On the day they finally carried the baby out, Ethan walked beside Lena, holding the door for her, his eyes soft but determined. The drive was quiet, filled only with the sound of the baby's gentle breaths. When they reached Lena's small apartment, Ethan paused at the threshold, waiting for her to decide if he belonged inside. She looked at him for a long moment before finally stepping aside. "You can come in," she murmured, her voice cautious, but not closed. Ethan stepped in, his chest tight. The apartment was modest but warm, filled with signs of a life Lena had built on her own, a life he hadn't been there to witness. Pictures of the children lined the walls, drawings and toys littered the floor. Ethan's throat closed as he realized how many birthdays, how many first words, how many scraped knees he had missed. Later that night, after the children were asleep, Lena sat across from him at the kitchen table. The weight of unspoken words hung between them. She stirred her tea slowly before finally saying, "I don't know if I can trust you, Ethan. I don't know if I can ever believe you won't leave again." He nodded, his gaze steady. Then don't believe my words. Believe my actions, every day. I'll show up, for them, for you, until one day, maybe, you'll see I'm not the man I was. For the first time, Lena didn't argue. She didn't tell him to leave. She just sat there, quiet, her eyes glistening as though the battle inside her was shifting. And as Ethan watched her, he realized something. The fight for her forgiveness wasn't a battle to win. It was a journey to walk, one step at a time, with patience, humility, and love. For the first time in years, he wasn't chasing success, or wealth, or power. He was chasing something far greater, something fragile, yet fierce, a chance to rebuild. Not just a family, but the trust of the only woman who had ever truly seen him. And he knew, deep in his soul, that this was the fight worth everything.